In early January 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed to consider an appeal from the federal government in a controversial immigration case involving a Chinese national with a U.S. green card who was convicted of a crime in the United States. The core of the case is whether the government can revive a removal order that was previously canceled or vacated by a lower court after an appeals court found that immigration authorities had violated the law in how they handled the individual's return to the U.S. following travel abroad. This Supreme Court decision will review and decide a major question about the scope of immigration enforcement authority, what counts as a valid removal order, and how past criminal convictions affect immigration status, especially for lawful permanent residents. The Supreme Court's decision to take the case means that it will now examine a major question about the scope of immigration enforcement authority, what counts as a valid removal order, and how past criminal convictions affect immigration status, especially for lawful permanent residents. This is significant because it touches on immigration law, due process, and the authority of federal agencies like the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, when it comes to deporting non-citizens with criminal records. The central figure is a Chinese citizen who legally held a U.S. green card, lawful permanent resident status. This individual had been convicted of a crime, specifically counterfeiting, in New Jersey. After traveling abroad to China and attempting to re-enter the U.S., the man was detained by immigration officials. A removal, deportation, order against him was issued, but the lawfulness of that order was later challenged. A federal appeals court ruled that immigration authorities violated the law when they classified and reinstated the removal order after his return. The appeals court therefore vacated, set aside, the removal order, meaning the deportation was no longer enforceable at that stage. The U.S. government, specifically the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, and Department of Justice, DOJ, filed an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. The government is asking the Supreme Court to revive the original removal order and clarify that DHS did not act unlawfully when it classified the aggravated criminal conviction and reimposed a removal order. In January 2026, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the government's appeal. That means the court will decide whether the appeals court was correct to cancel the removal order or whether the government should be allowed to proceed with deportation. This case touches on several important legal and policy questions. Under U.S. immigration law, certain criminal convictions, especially crimes involving fraud, moral turpitude, or significant sentences, can make a non-citizen removable, deportable. A lawful permanent resident who later commits a disqualifying crime can lose the right to stay in the United States and be ordered removed. What this case raises is whether DHS had the authority to treat the individual's criminal conviction as disqualifying after he re-entered the country, and whether the timing and classification of that conviction were handled properly. Removal orders are not always final when issued. There are specified legal procedures under the Immigration and Nationality Act, INA, for how and when they can be appealed or challenged in federal courts. Some decisions are considered final orders of removal and can only be reviewed under certain conditions. Other parts of immigration law limit when courts can review immigration decisions at all. Lower courts have sometimes found that technical issues, like how the order was issued, what the statute says about review rights, or whether the individual had proper notice, affect whether a removal order can stand. The Supreme Court's decision in this case will establish a binding rule on how those processes should work when a removal order is vacated and then contested by the government. This case occurs in the broader context of ongoing disputes over immigration enforcement in the U.S., including debates over deportations, detention authority, limits on judicial review, and how criminal convictions intersect with immigration status. The Supreme Court has been handling multiple immigration-related disputes, like whether certain removal proceedings can be reviewed, or how protections under treaties like the Convention Against Torture apply. The central timeline of the case is as follows. The appeals court vacated the removal order after determining DHS acted unlawfully. The government filed an appeal to the Supreme Court, which agreed to hear the case in early January 2026. A schedule for oral arguments or briefing has not yet been publicly released, but the court's agreement to hear the case indicates it believes the legal issues are significant enough to require its direct interpretation. Once the court sets a hearing date, attorneys for both sides will file written briefs laying out their legal arguments. Then, the justices will hear oral arguments, often months after the case is accepted. A decision could come at the end of the current Supreme Court term, which typically runs through June 2026. A Supreme Court ruling that favors the government could strengthen DHS's authority to revive deportation orders even after lower courts vacate them, make it easier for the government to deport lawful permanent residents with criminal convictions if there are technical issues with their reentry or classification, and reduce judicial oversight in some immigration enforcement decisions. A ruling favoring the respondent could limit the government's power to enforce removal orders when procedural errors are present, increase the requirements on DHS to follow strict legal procedures before deporting immigrants, and give more power to federal courts to review immigration cases in detail. Because immigration and deportation affect millions of people in the United States, this case is likely to attract attention from civil rights groups, immigrant advocacy organizations, and immigration law experts, and could influence future policy debates. The Supreme Court's decision to hear the government's request to revive a removal order against a Chinese national convicted of a crime marks the start of an important legal battle over immigration enforcement authority and procedural fairness. While the government argues it acted within the law, the opposing view is that procedural errors or misclassification of the individual's conviction undermine the validity of the deportation order. The Supreme Court's ruling, expected by mid-2026, will clarify how far immigration authorities can go in enforcing removal orders and how much power federal courts have to review those decisions. Because this case intersects criminal convictions, immigration procedures, and federal enforcement power, its outcome will likely set precedent and affect similar cases for years to come.